Our final plenary speaker for the 2023 National Sexual Assault Conference is Dr. Apryl Alexander. Dr. Alexander is the Metrolina Medical Foundation Distinguished Scholar in Health and Public Policy at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. That's a long title, and you deserve it. You earned it, right? She combines the work of direct service providers, researchers, and clinicians to examine how oppressive systems create barriers to ending all types of violence and provides tangible solutions to work towards safer communities. David and I heard Dr. Alexander speak last year at the ATSA conference, and like we did with Dr. Alan Walker, we were texting in the middle of the session saying we have to have her for our conference. And she was kind enough to agree, and here she is. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alexander.
Said it's hard going now. You know, it's the 50th anniversary of hip hop, and every good hip hop artist of the 80s and 90s had a great hype person, so Cherie was that for us. So, for myself, I want to talk about justice today. That for a lot of us in this room, I think we've had times in our lives where we've had to examine what is justice. If I were to poll all 2,000 plus of you at this conference on giving me the definition of justice, I would probably have 2,000 different answers. Some things overlapping, some things different and unique. In trying to explore how do we get to this stage of justice, that each and every one of us came to this conference invested in intervention and violence prevention. We each are thinking about how do we find justice as we explore public safety. In our pursuit of justice, we also have to think about different forms of justice. We've talked about climate justice, reproductive justice, justice against state-sanctioned violence in these recent years. What does that look like for us? How do we come to a common place? I remember when the verdict for Derek Chauvin came down. I do a lot of media work, so every media outlet had me on speed dial, ready to get my reaction. One of the questions that each of those reporters asked me is, now that we have this verdict, was justice served? I'm glad I had the same reactions in the audience. For me, I was a bit confused and baffled by the question. I was taken aback. And I think the reporters were wanting to see some joy from me. Maybe some sadness. Relief that there was a conviction. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I think I said something to the effect of true justice would have been Mr. Floyd going home to his family that day. So for me, I've been continuing the kind of struggle of what this notion of justice is and what it looks like in our environments. Doing a series of research projects right now and upcoming centered around justice in various definitions. One of those projects is looking at a belief in a just world. That a belief in a just world is defined that the world works out in positive ways. Everyone gets what they deserve. We catch the bad guys and the survivors get justice. Do you know that there are people who have a strong belief in a just world? I'm getting humor at all the wrong spots today. If we think about this developmentally, and I work with adolescents, that's what we would expect. Growing up, we were getting those messages that, yes, the cops get the robbers go to jail, everybody gets their success. And that that we think maybe over time that goes away, but what I'm finding is there are people who truly hold on to that belief in a just world and believe it exists. I think I might have been one of those people. I think in some ways I did know about the systemic inequities, systems of oppression and how they bled out, but I didn't quite understand how that came to be in terms of violence and violence prevention. I went to college as an animal and poultry science major. See, that was the funny part. I wanted to be a veterinarian. All my life I wanted to help and support animals. It was by chance that I was in a psychology class and then took a leap and wanted to volunteer at a local women's center. That's when I figured out that justice wasn't being met. Hearing the stories of folks who were coming to the shelter, calling into the hotline, and hearing about injustice after injustice. I even served as a care companion where we would go to hospitals and police stations after a person had experienced violence to offer them support and resources. I got to witness some of the mistreatment by law enforcement. I would leave the hospital and wonder, what's next for that person? They wouldn't have gotten a ride home if I wasn't there. This can't be justice. This is not the just world that I was promised as a child. And then along the way, I wanted to start working with individuals who caused harm. That was also by accident. When I started grad school, we took an ethics class. In that class, they asked us, what is an area that you can't work in or need more training in working in? And I still have this essay on my Dropbox. I said, I will never, ever, 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 ever work with somebody who's caused sexual harm. Filed it away and didn't think much of it until I started working in residential treatment for youth. Oops. So these children who had experienced victimization themselves were starting to engage in problematic sexual behavior. Even though I didn't intend to work with this population, I was thrust into it. And that started to change my mind on things. So I spoke to my professor, and we had an outpatient sex offense treatment program for adults, and I started working there. When I started working there, I had to figure out how I was navigating these both sides. That my whole life I wanted to dedicate myself to protecting and supporting and being with victims and survivors, but now I'm working with people who've caused them harm. Some folks even called me out on it. How could you? This isn't what you said you wanted to do for a living. I remember speaking to a mentor who conceptualized it or had to justify it, but said, either space, we're invested in public safety. We're invested in the protection of folks. And again, these child victims are now victimizing others. Where was their support and where was their help? And so things started to change for me. I think that things started to kind of rupture over time and started to really reformulate my idea of what justice is. What would a system in a world look like if we had equity? I spoke to some of you yesterday, and I'm doing a series of focus groups to talk about what culturally responsive care would look like. And a slight variation of the question that I'm posing to folks is, how will we know that we're in an equitable system? Whether that's a school system, a treatment system, or our world at large, how will we know that we've achieved equity? It's a huge question. And I've seen people pause and even struggle of even imagining what that would look like. So that kind of brings us back to that belief in a just world. I don't think that everyone who holds on to that belief in a just world is fantastical, maybe even delusional. I think what they have is a belief that we could have hope in a just world. What would it look like from a liberation perspective to hold on to that hope that things would improve and get better? What would it take for us to get there, to get to that tipping point? One of the other projects that I'm working on right now is looking at reparations. We started this conference with our indigenous siblings saying, we want more than the land and labor acknowledgements. And I was back there clapping. That when we talk about translational justice, it starts with the acknowledgement. It starts with an apology, or Alyssa Ackerman said, an amend. But what's next? What would the holistic healing process look like? Because we know that the harms to marginalized communities didn't just start now. They've been around for generations. How are we repairing that systemic and intergenerational harms that have been caused? Even when we bring up the idea of reparations in the United States, particularly for Black Americans, people brush it off like it's unrealistic. But we've had incidents of reparations, monetary, symbolic reparations here in the United States in the past. It's not unachievable. What would it look like for our system to model repair for harms being caused? Because that's very similar to the work that we hope to do in this space. So I want us to think about what's next for us in this room. Sometimes I hate coming to conferences because they challenge me to do more work. The conference theme is Equity in Action. What are you taking away from this conference to your communities, to your place of work? What has changed for you? Because hopefully you are not the same person that you were a few days ago when you entered this space. You've learned something new. You've had some recollection. You've been challenged. You have some new ideas. What did you learn about equity in action that you're going to apply? I think our call to action is, now I need you to apply it. I've been a little burnt out these last few years since the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and others, because I've been called to do trainings on things like microaggressions. So I've gone to employment settings, corporations, school settings to talk about how do you address microaggressions. It's an hour and a half, 2-hour training. I go through what microaggressions are, how do we address them in the moment. And after each and every one of those trainings, when we get to the Q&A, someone who wants to be an effective ally says, but what do I do? Getting stuck. I just told you what to do. We have to step up. Stepping up is going to look different for each and every one of us. I'm not going to have the same expectation for advocacy, activism, and allyship for every single person in this room. So even to ask me for advice, especially as a Black woman, I can't give you universal advice on how to do this work. Advocacy and activism is going to look different for each and every one of you. But the key word is action. In this tense sociopolitical time, action is needed now more than ever. And it's going to take a bunch of different strategies. What are we actively doing to combat misinformation and disinformation? What are you actively doing in your communities to address anti-Black racism? What are you actively doing to help these LGBTQ folks who are being targeted with this over 600 bills and pieces of legislation that is affecting their livelihoods and well-being? What are you doing for each and every one of those issues? No, Apryl, I can't handle it all. Sure, but you're a person in a system whether that's your family system, your community system, your religious and spiritual system, and our society at large. What are you doing to address that? What can you do? One, this is going to take direct action. So we're first starting interpersonally and seeing what you need to do in your everyday life. I was so excited to see at this conference ways that we can step up and support minoritized leaders. Ways that we can address the inequities in our settings and workplaces. I hope you got tools from each of those sessions on what you can do in your everyday lives. Next is we're going to have to engage in public policy advocacy. We have to combat this tense legislation that's happening right now. Are you informed of what's going on in your communities? Are you aware? Have you attended a city council meeting lately? Because they are making decisions about us, for us, that are affecting our livelihoods that you don't even know about right now because you're not paying attention. And so we can't get mad after the fact when you didn't vote, you weren't going to those meetings, and your workplace wasn't informed of it. So some of that action is we're going to have to step up and step forward. You might not be the person who has the personality to speak up at the city council meeting or your state general assembly, but there's someone in your network who can. You can write a letter. So that direct action. Social justice is simply advocating and championing for the well-being of all people. As we continue to explore this pursuit of justice, this hope and belief in a just world, we need to engage in action right now because we have too much to lose. I need you to think about what equity in action looks like for you, what it looks like for victims and survivors, even if you identify as one, and how we are going to have our just world. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, David. Thank you.